begin.
Thank you. I want to first take just a quick minute to welcome everybody on this call. Sister Sabrina Jordan has just joined us from Dayton. The Ohio Families Unite Against Police Brutality. We know we've got Reverend Joel King from Columbus, Reverend David Bush from the Columbus and Akron area. We got Reverend Dr. Dana Murray. We got Dr. Dana Murray Patterson out of there. I always want to make you the preacher too, Sister Dana, who we're glad on. We've just had Pastor Jones out of the great city of Tuskegee, and we appreciate your being on. I did say Reverend Joel King out of Columbus, Ohio, I believe. I think Brother Dexter Wimbush, Judge Wimbush, and always have to put him in both categories. He's both the judge, the preacher, the attorney, so he fills all three of those slots. And of course, Chief Leon Frazier, who is our dynamite criminal justice leader in so many different areas. There are two things that we wanted to look at here today, and I'm going to take a few moments to go into just a little bit of detail. And I want to start with the first D word that we wanted to discuss, and that was de-escalation. What is de-escalation? What does it look like? What does it mean where our police departments are concerned, and what, if any, role do we play that represent certainly the historic Black church? De-escalation training is a training that is centered around teaching, training, modeling through our police officers something other than taking the most serious approach to a particular problem that they can absolutely take. It's teaching alternatives to some of the more violent responses. De-escalation, and there are arguments on both sides of this coin, and I think it's important that we hear both arguments on each side of this coin. De-escalation is something that is very difficult to teach because people have a tendency to react in the spur of the moment based on their human form, not so much on their uniform. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but they have a tendency to go to the human form over the uniform. So when you talk about de-escalation, it's like talking about any other policies. As Brother Bush was just saying, you can have a particular policy or a set of laws around policing, but it doesn't mean that in the spur of the moment that those laws are what's going to be on your heart, on your mind, and people have a tendency to do what they think they can do, they can get away with. So for those who are pro de-escalation training, it certainly has merit. For those who question, but don't we already do de-escalation training? In many police departments across the United States, absolutely, they do de-escalation training, and it does not seem to have solved the complete problem or certainly all of the ills. I think the church has a responsibility, however, to ensure that when it comes to de-escalating, that we have a relationship where our police departments are concerned, that we're able to fuse the community and police together in such a way that goes back to something I just said, and that is getting police officers to show up in their human form, not just their uniform. And I think that you do that when you have relationship. I had a conversation earlier today, and I raised this as a question. We refer to our law enforcement people as professionals, but we also refer to attorneys as professionals. We refer to doctors as professionals. But policing is that one discipline where having a college degree is not something that is made mandatory, but at the same time, we're allowed to wear that same title of professional. So my question became, what happens? Because you really can't be a police officer in most jurisdictions or enter the police academy until you're 6 months out, at least, from your 21st birthday. What happens between 18 and that 20-month period out from your 21st birthday? Where do you spend your time? What do you do? In too many cases, the fellows sit around. You know, they may take a job here or there, but they sit around and the good old boys have a tendency of drinking beer with the fellas and hanging out like everybody else. Oftentimes, they even have little minor skirmishes with the law themselves that if we can blame on a juvenile record, we're able to get over and to get past and can still become sworn police officers. But when you come from the hills, when you come from a certain part of town, it doesn't mean that you've had any kind of contact whatsoever with people that don't look like you. So I suggested during that 2-year period, I don't see anything wrong with earning an associate law enforcement degree, where you may have to go to school with some people that don't look like you, that don't agree with you, that don't come from your background. So I'm suggesting de-escalation as a way of life, where we show up as police officers in our human form and not count on it just when we're in our uniform. So I think that as certainly as men and women of the gospel, our responsibility is to ensure that we're bringing the community and the police together in a way like we haven't seen in a lot of years, because we have got police officers in our churches and we have community members who have been affected, in many cases by a rogue policeman who's also in our churches. So without looking like we're anti-police, and I tell people all the time, I am not anti-police. I'm anti-wrongdoing. It just doesn't matter to me whether the wrongdoer is wearing red, blue, or if the wrongdoer is wearing a badge and a gun. And I think that that's the approach that those of us in the clergy community have to take, and we have to become a part of the education process, education that can take place inside our churches, that begins with the relationship, and then we're able to educate by bringing both sides of this thing together. The other D that we wanted to spend some time talking about today is a little more controversial than de-escalation, and that is defunding. Is it possible to defund police? First of all, let me tell you what defunding really means. I think we need to have this working definition, because I have seen where the other side now has put out some commercials where somebody calls 911 and they get a recording that says, because of defunding, there's nobody available to accept your call. And they're using the call for defunding as a means politically to scare people into voting for one party versus the other party. Defunding has nothing to do with shutting down police departments. It has nothing to do with taking all of the resources out of policing. What defunding talks about is this: the average police department budget in any average municipality, the budget averages between 20 and 45%. Those are averages. And it's closer in most communities to 45% of an entire city's budget for services. Imagine you've got maybe 40 to 60 departments within a urban administration of its government, with half of its resources going to one discipline. That's the police. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, we used to say, and I heard Dr. Cornel West used to say all the time, it's the only discipline in the world where you can literally commit murder and get vacation for it. And that's because of unions. One of the biggest problems I see in fixing broken police departments are the union negotiated contracts where and I expect these men and women who wear uniform to get paid for it. I expect them to be treated right, but we have to question, how far do we go? When you talk then about defunding, here's what people are suggesting. They're suggesting a cutback in how much of the dollars and cents are being used in police departments. For instance, some of the funds that go into police departments are federal funds and money that come from the Fed government. Most of that money does not come necessarily physically. It comes by giving them this credit card, so to speak, where you can buy military equipment, where you can buy tanks, where you can buy jeeps, where you can buy all of the kinds of things that are used in war. So the first message sent to any community is, oh, we're supposed to be at war with them because they're getting war materials, and we have to be very careful about that. So defunding means, and I agree with this, when you call police officers to handle a mental situation, they're no more equipped to handle that person with the average officer. Doesn't mean all of them, because I've learned all of nothing is true. There are some who have that kind of training, who have that kind of background as individuals. But by and large, that is not what police officers have been trained to do. One of my favorite shows has become First 48 because I like to look at the backstories. But the truth of the matter is, in the first 48, when the police officer shows up, the police officer on the beat is not the one who investigates the homicide. They send for the homicide unit. And they've got somebody on call in every city in America who goes out to investigate the homicide. He's a specialist. She's a specialist. That's why they call on them. I believe that when it comes to mental health issues, that we can have the same kind of situation. The question becomes, how do you pay them? That's when defunding comes into play. Defunding means that out of this $120 million that we spend on policing in this one city alone, we're going to take just $20 million out of that. And we're going to put some people on board who have this expertise to deal with mental problems. And when we're getting calls and we know that there's some mental health issues, we're going to have somebody we can call out. Schools, prison, the school to prison pipeline. We now employ police officers to work in our schools that don't have counselors, that don't have nurses, that don't have social workers. And the reason that education institutions are saying we don't have these things, not because we don't want them, we can't afford it because the bulk of our city's dollars are going into policing. That should not be the case. Teachers don't need to be able to call the police because little Willie messing up this morning, because this little girl didn't do her homework and now she's acting out when the teacher asked for it. I don't know what they may be going through at home. I don't know what their situation is. I don't know if it's a physical thing. I don't know if it's a mental thing. But what I do know is we have to put money back into resources, back into seeing what the underlying conditions are. And that has nothing to do with police. When you talk about parents who have lost young people due to the school shootings that have taken place, there are mothers and their fathers and their students in those buildings who will tell you more police is not what we need in schools. It's better resources and people who are prepared professionally to meet the challenges that we often bring to school with us on a daily basis. So defunding police has nothing to do with saying we're not going to pay police, we're going to not let them have good benefits, we're going to defund them. Now, there has been one case where a police department quite literally was shut down. There's been two in the sense that there's a second city now who has suggested it. But only in one case was the police department literally shut down, literally defunded. And that was in Camden, New Jersey, back in 2010, I believe it was. Camden, New Jersey at that time was thought to have the worst, most corrupt police department in the entire country. The city leadership, against the wishes of then Governor Chris Christie, said, we're going to shut this police department down because of the systemic problems. It's from the bottom to the top. It's from the top to the bottom. And the only way we know how to deal with it is to shut the whole thing down, put everybody out of a job, start from scratch, which doesn't mean we may not bring some of those people back, but it gave them the opportunity to go through every officer's record. It gave them the opportunity to find out who was in charge, to see what they needed to do. That's complete shutting down. That is not defunding. So far, it's worked for them. The crime numbers have dropped. The relationship between police and community has improved. And the second city was just in 2020, the very city where George Floyd happened to have been killed, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The city commission there has now taken a vote, and the vote was to literally shut the police department, to shut the police department completely down, starting from scratch and rebuilding. It doesn't mean you don't have police services. They contract with the county sheriff, they contract with their state police agencies, and they still have policing that's being done, but it gives them an opportunity to start over. So defunding is not taking all the money away from. Defunding is the reallocation of sources. So I think until we're at this place where we understand the terminology, what then should the pastor's position be? I have no problem with the pastor who says, let's defund, as long as we explain what defunding is. In fact, I'm a supporter of defunding, as long as we understand it's the reallocation of resources. Now, it's another issue when you talk about closing down altogether. I'm not sure I can get behind that, but I can easily find myself getting behind the defunding concept to make sure that our schools have the resources that they need, to make sure that our communities have the mental health resources, as well as the other resources that are needed. Thank you.
So now, let me just say one thing to what you said, and that is mental health. Mental health has been dumped in the laps of police officers. While most mental health institutions around this country have been shut down and disbanded, and that is causing chaos in the street. And to give you just a quick example, right here in little old Tuskegee, as personable as we are, we had a police officer pick up a mentally ill youngster who walks the street, talks to himself, harass people, beg for money, and he's known to just about everybody around town. Well, somebody called the police on him. A police officer, this was a Black police officer, and this is what disgusts me, went over, picked him up, took him somewhere, handcuffed him to a chair, took video of him, put him on Facebook, and referred to him as a crazy N-word. Now, I don't know yet what the chief is going to do to that police officer, but I'm hoping that he'll take care of some serious business on it. But I am going to move to go to the probate judge, didn't have time to do it today, and see if we can come together and put something together to take this young man off of the street, get him into a facility that will have to be in another county, because we don't have anything in this county, and get him some help. So two things need to be done: treatment for him and discipline for that police officer. And I mean, I hope it is serious discipline. And I'd like for Reverend Jones, if you would, to speak to this issue, because I know you have lots of experience in federal and local governance, as well as a hookup with the good Lord above, sir. Could I hear from you?
Thank you, Chief. And Bishop, you make a very salient point in reference to those two issues, the de-escalation and defunding. I think so often when terminology is chosen or selected, we don't give much thought as to what the hearer will perceive when we put terminology in place. For instance, dealing with the de-escalation, one of the critical things that I've seen early in my law enforcement career was the lack of vetting or the inadequacy of the vetting process, in which we end up with young people coming into law enforcement careers who are not suited for that kind of power. And as a result, they require more handling, more supervision. They required a great deal of interaction, which put us in a situation of having to reallocate human resources to ride shotgun on them and not necessarily provide the public safety that we were dealing with. Another item that we had a great deal of issues with the National Park Service. I worked at an urban park, which carried a whole different set of issues that folks didn't deal with at the Great Smoky Mountains or Blue Ridge Parkway. You know, I'm working at a park where we knew people were going to come out and recreate, i.e., they were going to have fun using the alcohol or drug of their choice, which in turn opened the door for other types of public safety issues that we were going to have to address. As long as we had adequate personnel, we could provide the necessary interaction and supervision to prevent the escalation of events. When there weren't any incidents, our budget went down because the thought was, oh, you all got that under control. Let's reallocate these resources. As soon as resources were taken away, and we now required 2 or 3 rangers to do what we used to rely on 15 rangers to do, now we saw an increase in accidental drownings, driving under the influence, public drunkenness, et cetera. We had a whole plethora of issues that would have or could have been prevented just by the presence of having someone there to interact with people. And that was a constant battle. At the end of the day, what many of our agencies are dealing with, when I get my pool of money in which you've given me this charge to provide for the public safety, and then you come take my money away, now you're forcing me to reallocate resources. You're forcing me to change my philosophy on this public service that I'm to be providing. And that's not necessarily bad, because I still don't understand why police departments need an armored personnel carrier. At the same token, if you're dealing in an area that is a high drug community, we need to have some kind of interaction to be able to provide for the public safety. That should be the #1 priority. I yield.
Information from Bishop McQuarrie, defining and educating on what de-escalation and defunding means. It's quite interesting given the recent opportunities we have with unarmed men being shot down by police officers. One of the things I noticed that my expertise is in management, over 30 years of experience. And so just as these officers typically aren't mental health professionals, their supervisors and leaders come from their ranks and they're not good at managing, right? So just as if you're in a store and you have conflict with a customer, the customer is irate, the manager doesn't come up and immediately put his hands on the customer and throw them to the ground and say, get out of here. They're taught to de-escalate the situation. Talk to them calmly, ascertain what the issue is, and try to come to a resolution. And so what component is missing from that police training in most instances is they're being trained on how to deal with the citizen as a customer. And so that's, I think, a very important component as we move forward in educating and trying to deal with some of these issues, is realizing that the supervisor is going to act like the police officer. I heard it from a former police chief. I don't want any punks working on my police force. But the old adage, I believe, is also true. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And so every time they go out on a call, especially in our neighborhoods, they feel like they're going to confront some type of mystical force that's going to threaten their lives. And so they come out to the scene on edge. And so once we realize what's going on and we're understanding that human form, and we need to bring that human form closer to the uniform, be professional. It's in their code of conduct. It's written in their policies, but they're not being held account to it by the very person or persons who are supervising them. And so also I wanted to speak on the budgets. So in the recent months, I've been beginning to look at some of the budgets that these cities have, which I live here in Columbus and it's enormous. The city of Columbus budget is almost $2 billion. $700 million of that goes to public safety. if you divide it down to the number of officers that are on the police force, the average salary of a police officer is $160,000 in the city of Columbus. And so the public is paying this money. Most times we don't even know what money we're paying. We should have a better expectation of professionalism for somebody making that kind of money. For somebody with a gun in their hand who is literally licensed to kill us. And so when you talk about de-escalation and defunding, I think those conversations have to go hand in hand, because the expectation is that you de-escalate. If you don't de-escalate, then we need to add to that the part of defunding. We need to take some of these funds and divert it to other avenues. One thing I noticed, I was trying to look up the budget in Kennesaw, Wisconsin, and it looks like either they got so much information that their website shut down or they shut it down. But I noticed their city budget is about $267 million. Not large. It's not a large city. But you're looking at now a person who was shot who may have a lawsuit of $100 million. And so the citizens are going to have to pay that money.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Dana Patterson, what do you say?
Absolutely. I appreciate the clarifications that were made around defunding the police. Honestly, I think that there are a lot of people who consider themselves very knowledgeable who did not have a clear understanding of what defunding the police means. And so they're easily swept into sort of the propaganda that has been swirling around that and the very political rhetoric around that. I just was going to say, one of the things I really appreciate the idea of, letting the human show up and letting that that idea of being more human in the place. I've been doing a lot of work here recently with people across differences, especially a lot of white allies that are wanting to understand empathy and understand how it is that empathy plays a part, and practicing empathy can make us better human beings. And so what I start off sharing with everyone is that bias in and of itself is not an issue. We all have bias. Sometimes the bias saves our lives. I have a bias against snakes, and I just don't like them. And so I avoid them at all costs, and I stay away from them. So bias in and of itself is not the issue, but the power and the privilege combined with that, with then your biases, and then having the power to treat people differently, to give people different access to systems and to procedures based upon the power that you have, and your bias combined with that. An unchecked bias, an unrecognized bias, is what has caused so many issues for people not being able to get in touch with their humanity when it comes to dealing with individuals one to another. So I am really, really working to get that, to provide opportunities for individuals to just practice empathy. And a lot of empathy is about what it means to really listen to another person, to listen with your team, which is a Chinese verb for using not just your ears to listen, but your eyes and also your heart, and having all of those in your undivided attention. So that's the Chinese verb for to listen. It involves all of that. And so I encourage people to really listen to others, hear their story, because only when we care about others, whether or not their issues are our issues or not, only when we develop a relationship and that we care about others will we be willing to stand up and do something about issues that do not affect us directly. Because eventually, if we continue to wait, those issues will affect us directly. They will come right into our living room, into our home, into our church, and sometimes into our own very lives. So that is what I would like to say. And I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this further and to gain a better sense of what it means to defund the police and to reallocate resources into some of the training that would allow us to further examine our biases and the power and privilege and the responsibility that we have to do things differently.
I guess my comment is not necessarily about, we're looking at this from the angle of the police department and defunding and de-escalation. But I think one thing we need to think about is, how do we train de-escalation in our communities? The thing that I'm afraid of is I watch what happened in Kenosha. The idea that people are beginning to disregard instructions by police departments, and it's putting themselves in positions where they end up where they shouldn't be. You know, it's one thing when we have these incidents and people are complying with the police department, and you're talking about de-escalation. You can advocate for that. You know, they're doing everything they can, but more and more, what I'm seeing is incidents where people are just not listening to police officers. You know, whether they're scared, you know, whatever the case may be, and they put themselves in a situation where you don't know what's happening in that environment, and it's actually escalating the environment. We had a situation here in Atlanta last week where the police came onto somebody's porch, and they ended up firing this guy, white police officer, for tasing this young lady, and they fired him almost within 24 hours. And the reason they gave for firing him was that he was not nice to the woman, because he was there investigating an incident that happened where one of the people on the porch allegedly destroyed some property, and the neighbor called the police officer. He went on to the porch, and it escalated from that. She ended up getting tased. You know, a case like that, when they look at it, you know, that's something where his termination is probably going to be overturned. But it could have been prevented if there was some sort of cooperation. And we're seeing people trying to use this culture to do things that normally they couldn't do. And so I think it's incumbent on us to talk to community members about how do you interact with police in order to help de-escalate the situation when you can. I'm not talking about the situation where it's obvious that the police are out of control or jumping to conclusions, but sometimes people, the community members and the way they're dealing with police, and a lot of it's frustration, but that frustration is creating situations where, you know, the worst thing in the world ends up happening, and it could have been prevented if people are more apt to listen and try to cooperate. And I know that I hate to use the word cooperate, because, you know, it's like everybody's saying, well, people are trying to cooperate, but in some cases they're just not.
You are absolutely correct, and I saw that video, and that was a taseable offense as far as I'm concerned. However, there are a lot of investigative information that would have to be brought forth in order to determine exactly what happened and why. And I too agree that police officers need to be better respected, except for those who are
We're talking about defunding the police and de-escalation, correct? So I think for me, I've heard, and I jumped on late, so I won't be long, but a lot of the things when I think of defunding the police or de-escalation, and then some of the things that people say that police officers need, I have to push back. Even when it comes to, like Dr. Patterson was saying, the biases, we visited these places a long time ago. This is just like this continuing like hamster on the wheel type deal for me. when we talk about defunding the police, I do agree that there are certain things within the police department that needs to be defunded, which is the social service aspect of it. Police get hired to protect and serve, even though we know that in the beginning they're not protecting, they're answering a call, but after that you continue to protect, or you move into protecting. But I think when we think about like ICE, when we talk about defunding, we need to look at defunding ICE, defunding the militarization of the police department, defunding, looking at that. And when we talk about de-escalation, that's a hard spot for me. And the reason I say that is, being someone who got a master's in criminal justice, I kind of understand it from both sides. And when you think about a person or a police officer being put into a situation where they think it's harmful, they're going to respond that way. I think for me, it goes back to, because they have a point of discretion, being able to just prove beyond the fact of your discretion, because it did create an unjust harm, was justified. And I just don't think it's a point that police officers don't know how to de-escalate. I just think it's a point of a mixture of things. So I don't really want to touch on that because I been and got flogged. But the biases, the implicit bias, the explicit bias, police officers have been through that training. When we think about training the police officers on other things, police officers have gone through the training. We have to just call it what it is. There's some bad apples in the police department. There's a culture of policing that's there that has been a part of policing for a very long time, which continues to perpetuate these racial disparities, these racial tensions, which result in wrongful deaths. And until you can change the culture of policing, and I'll be honest, yeah, you can defund a whole lot of things, and there are things that need to be defunded. But until you change some aspects of the culture of policing, we're going to continue to revisit this over and over and over again until we get to a point where police officers can come from our community, and they can, and rather than bringing them from Defiance, Ohio, where they ain't never seen a Black person, and then want them to come to Dayton, Ohio, and understand. It's so many other things that we need to think about. Not to say that to have an all Black department is going to be free from flaws, because it won't. But at the same time, we have to look at some of these other changes that we can make. You do need to be able to de-escalate. We call it conflict resolution in school or whatever. But I also think this, and this is no pun against anybody. I had a brother who was murdered in broad daylight. But I will say this, and my mother was deceased, but as the sister who had to carry that burden of her brother being murdered, I also had to realize and ask, what harm was my brother creating on the community? And so I think these are some of the things we have to put inside of those questions as well.
I work with a lot of mothers here in Ohio who have lost sons and daughters from police brutality. We have been working with some state legislators on the de-escalation bill, and we wanted a police accountability bill. So during all that back and forth, it didn't get in there, but the de-escalation did get in there. The racial bias training, the mental health training, which is supposed to be annually and mandatory, because most of these police departments, the chief has a choice right now whether or not he wants his officers to get these special trainings. So it would have to be mandatory. And a lot of people have asked the question, well, just because they go to a little training, that's not going to make it any better. But at least I feel like, as I think Mr. Bush was saying, with all this money that they have, and they're talking about, first thing they want to say is, I was in fear of my life, but he was running away and you shot him. Okay, there was no de-escalation. So if you cannot prove, if you get this training annually and you cannot, and you go out there and shoot another male or female, and they were running, or they didn't have a gun, or any of that they can't prove, but you cannot use that. I was in fear of my life. I used, where's the de-escalation training? If you had it, you have to be able, when you shoot somebody, the question can come up, why did you not use your training? And that is at least that's something to bring up another question, because they're getting away with killing our kids every day. And I'm truly for and out there. We're making it aware that the HB 706, because like I said, it's a that leaves room for more questioning to us. You know, it's not going to solve anything overnight, but it's a start. It is a start. And we have to start somewhere. And if we can get that in later on, hopefully we can have something else amended to that bill. But right now it's a start, and we just need something. We need something, and we need something now.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And Reverend King, what say ye? And keep it short if you can. I'm going to reformat this whole program after all of these long-winded responses, but I love it because they're powerful. Go ahead, Reverend King.
Thank you, Chief. My point is, as before, the training is good, but the community got to get involved again with what's going on. We have given away everything to our police department, making them try to be strong in all our communities, because the federal law said respect the community, do all that. We have done all that. We don't call police just to be calling police. We call them because we need police, because we think the police will do what they're supposed to be doing. But when the police come in and they still shoot you in the back when you're running away, and I learned that a long time ago. I served as Gahanna police chaplain. We don't shoot no more to blame. We shoot to kill you. And that was a training from the federal government that's given out to the police. We don't shoot to disarm you or to lame you or stop you. We shoot to kill you. But all those people that get killed is us. So all the training we can do in the world, but the heart ain't right. It's good that we disrespect the good officers that we do have on the force. And why do we have the good officers on the force that never have these problems? But we got 2 or 3 that keep that job, or they go from one police station to another department and kill more people, and yet they remain a police officer. We never clean the force. Now, if I, as a Baptist preacher, if I got terminated in one church, believe me, I won't go nowhere else as a pastor, somewhere else. Because the Negroes, as we do, will make sure that happens nowhere. Then why we can't do the same thing with police? If you crooked in one town, why you go to the next town and still be a police officer? Yep, we don't. It ain't about training. It ain't about. It's just that's what I want to do. And so until the community stands up, give our rights back as community citizens, look at the contracts, look at the thing, and hold everybody accountable, from the police officers, from the city government, and even ourselves. That's going to help change some of the situation we got in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend King. And that went way over our 15 minutes, but it was meaningful that we heard from everybody, and everybody had their opportunity to deliver what is in your soul and in your heart. And I was scheduled to do the training on the police department. So now I'm going to throw some things out here that is meant to provoke, is meant to educate and to teach, and etc. Now, I have a theory based on more than 40 years of law enforcement experience that police officers are just like people. The only difference is police officers are a little bit good crazy, because it takes a crazy sense of self to decide to go out into the street, and when everybody else is running from gunfire, you're running to gunfire. When everybody else is running from a fire, you're running into the building to rescue somebody. And in the middle of the night, when everybody else, other people at home asleep and resting and relaxing, then you out in the dark streets, stopping cars with unknown subjects in them to check them for many different reasons. Some reasons, headlight out. Some reason, no tag light. Some reason, you ran a stop sign. Some reason, you ran a red light. But now, it takes a good crazy person to do that. And let me tell you about my definition of good crazy. It was Reverend Lowry who said that there's a good crazy and a bad crazy. A good crazy is getting into a demonstration where you know that the police will probably shoot tear gas into the crowd to disperse it. But you go in there anyway. And you go in there for a civic responsibility as a human being and a citizen to demand equal rights. Now, that's good crazy. Let me tell you what bad crazy is. Bad crazy is a citizen confronting 2 or 3 police officers and starting a fight in the street. Because that's a fight you ought to know that you cannot win. You just cannot win it. So it doesn't make sense to start it. Bad crazy is creating a problem in your family, beating your wife if you're a husband, pulling a gun on your husband if you are a wife, raping your children, and beating and harassing and demeaning your children. That's bad crazy. So now I point that good crazy, bad crazy out to show the difference between regular citizens and police officers. Because you have some citizens who are good crazy. 2 young boys I just heard about just a couple of weeks ago went into a burning house and brought several people out. They weren't police officers, but they were good crazy citizens. But now, take this from me, from my 40 years of experience. Police officers in most police departments in most cities can rank this way. About 60% of the police officers on the street are good, God-fearing, humanistic, kind people who will put themselves in front of you to stop a bullet. You could give them a car, an assignment, and instructions, and a purpose, and they could go out onto the street without supervision and take care of any business in their community. You have about 20% of the police officers, though, who they are kind of like fence straddlers. They want to do what they want to do, and they skirt policy to get it done. But if the discipline is too heavy, well, then they'll go on and do the right thing. And so, therefore, they will just do what they want to do, what they have to do, and get away with everything that they can. Now you got a final 20%. And this is not different from society, really. But you got that final 20%. They're there for the wrong reasons. They bring most of the shame on the police department. They commit most of the violent acts against citizens. They shoot people just based on that psychological thing of state of mind, because that's what they want to do. Queen Mother Amelia Boynton Robinson did a lot during her lifetime. She is the matriarch of the voting rights movement. And she did a lot of work with young people. And she would always ask young people, what is it that you want to do when you grow up? And most of the time she was very enthused by the answers that they would give. Want to be a doctor, want to be a nurse, you know, want to be a police officer, and etc. And she asked this one little boy, why do you want to be a police officer? He was about 10 years old, she said. And he said, because I want to kill somebody. She said, well, why would you want to kill somebody? Because somebody killed my brother. And I want to kill them. Well, let me tell you, I believe that a lot of police officers go for the power and the badge and the gun and just the basic authority to tell people when to stop and when to go, you know, to carry out their own whatever scheme or resentment or retaliation against society or somebody that impacted them in a wrong way in their lifetime. But let me tell you, people, the police are being blamed for a lot of stuff that is not on them. Because just like I figure them to be 60-20-20, citizens are just as predictable. You got good citizens out here that will do anything in the world to help everybody. You got other citizens out here who will scheme and scam to get everything they get and mistreat people in the process. And then you got that citizen out here who is cold-blooded, don't care nothing about nobody and you. And if you take the police officers away, and if you turn the community over to that type person, you'll have a Chicago and a Philadelphia and a New York City on the weekend in every community in this land. Because you know what? We just don't do enough of the right stuff. And the change that this society needs is within all of us. All of us. We lie too much. We drink too much. We do too much dope. We rape our people too much. We fight and abuse our people too much. We kill each other too much. And it's based on something that psychiatrists and psychologists need to go to work on to first determine what is wrong with us. Because you know what? Police officers are just a recruitment process away from you, the community. And you ask the question, why don't they train them better? Well, why don't you train better? Why don't they do better? Well, good. Why don't you do better? And when I say you, I'm talking about us. So now in this process of trying to bring some sanity to this whole thing about getting together in society, can't be just placed on the police now. And I hear them talking about reforming the police department. Let me tell you what the criminal justice system is, and then I'm going to shut up with this. The criminal justice system is the president, who nothing goes into law at the top level without him signing it. The criminal justice system is McConnell, who sits there and let laws come up and stack up, and as a one-man force, he blocks them. Doesn't make any difference what good is intended by Congress at large that is intended for our society. It doesn't matter to him. Then The criminal justice system is the attorney general, and right now it's bar. A bar is nothing but a friend of the president and a lawyer for the president. Then you have the Supreme Court that they stack people into based on party love and trust and responsibility and obligation. Doesn't make any difference about what society needs if the Republicans have 5 votes against it, or if the Democrats have 5 votes against it. And then it trickles right on down through that Supreme Court that has made a law that says that the police officers can get away with a lot of stuff in the street. Qualified immunity. And that's because of the crazy job that they have to do and the split-second decisions they have to make. Do you know that the average police shooting begins and ends in 10 to 17 seconds? I want you to think on that for a minute. I pull him over, get out of my car, walk up to his car, run into an old shuck situation, he has a gun in some cases. I have a gun. I got to unholster my gun, stop him from shooting me with his gun. And all of that is done in 10 to 17 seconds. So now there is no time to do no quality analysis about what the situation really represents. It's only time for me to save my life or to surrender my life. So you see, police officers have a very difficult road to hoe. And citizens, like I heard Judge Wimbush say, citizens could do a lot to lessen that load and to stop a lot of this mess that's going on in our society. So now, the criminal justice system trickles all the way down from the Supreme Court that I just talked to you about, through the state legislature, through the state Supreme Court, through the state legislation, right on down to the state attorney general, right on down to your city council, your DA, district attorney, and the police department in your town. And criminal justice goes all the way down to the security guard in grocery store on the corner. So now I intend here to provoke some people into opening up some discussion on me, because I've made it sound like police officers are no better than nobody else, but they are just as good. Open discussion.
I don't know if you made it sound like police officers are just like everybody else. But I think what you're driving home, Chief, is what David said, is that you have to, there's a human form beyond the uniform. But I have to be honest. I think what I wrestle with is sometimes knowing that you were a police officer and will be a police officer at heart, does it skew the opinions of what police officers do? Yeah, I just wrestle with that. I mean, I guess it would be the same way as, lawyer, or I don't know. So yeah, I mean, because it almost feels like the people are to blame for some of these things, which people are. But then there's like this reprieve that because police officers have to make this split-second decision, don't hold it against us. Understand that this is where we are. And because of that, we come from this way of thinking. We have to think on guard. We have to show up on guard. We have to respond on guard. We have to live on guard. And I also understand there's a set of traumas that police officers carry, because we don't see everything that you all see. And I get that. But I still think sometimes it feels like it just from policing, period, that very thing is the justifiable reason, the excuse that continues to perpetuate things like what we see from other police officers who don't care. Because that's the one thing that we have to be able to prove. Anybody who goes to a court of law has to be able to prove that a police officer was not in fear of their life. How do you prove that? To be able to then say this is something that needs to be addressed, or what goes inside of that discretionary power that police officers have that's given to them in their job, that can help to, for what people are pushing for, de-escalate some of this, or not to continue to be a permission slip as a way to get out of. And so I have a hard time with that, because that discretionary power and that split-second decision is not always a split-second decision, especially when my back is turned and I'm walking away with my hands up. There's nothing about what a police officer should fear. So I guess for me, it's like, help me to understand that part of it, and why do they continue to get away with it? Prefaced on that sentence alone, I feared for my life, like the other person didn't fear for their life.
I would agree with that. If I can say, my pushback is simple. There is a difference between a citizen and a police officer. And the fundamental difference is a police officer takes an oath that they're going to be a particular kind of way. As a citizen, I ain't take no oath to do anything, good, bad, or indifferent. That police officer took an oath as to how they would deal with me. Number two, I would push back on this. When it comes to a police officer showing up on the scene and me automatically jumping because he say jump and doing everything that officer says may save my life, but it doesn't make that officer right. There was a time when we could trust police that might have wanted to do the right thing, but we don't see a lot of that anymore, because we as citizens are allowed to question the police. I'm allowed to say, what did you pull me over for? I'm allowed to say, why are you even here? But when most police officers show up on the scene, that is not how they want you to think, respond, or react. There's a reason why when a 10-year-old little boy is outside shooting hoops outside his house, and a police officer is turning the corner to drive by his house, he stops dribbling and hides behind his daddy's car. There's a reason why little girls are crying and running to their mothers when a police officer pulls up. And it ain't because they so good all the time. It's because of what they've seen, and that's traumatic. It's because of what people have been through, and it's because of that misuse and abuse of authority. I don't expect the police necessarily to show up at my church and preach this morning. There's a different set of things that go into that. I also don't want to do the policeman's job, but I do always want to be human. I do always want to know that I'm approaching a situation as a human being. There are a lot of police officers who think that because I said so. I fought against that with my own mama. So I would absolutely say something, and it's not right that now you're going to face my wrath because you had the audacity to say, because I said so. People have a right. It is not what once it was. You look at the city of Dayton, Ohio. What do you got? Almost 6% of the police officers are Black. In a city where more than 48% of the people are Black. There's no identification. There's no coming together. And I would define any police officer, and I'm a grown man, but I would define any officer to walk up to me, standing even on a city sidewalk, and say, turn around and put your hands behind your back, without you telling me why. And I think that what has happened is people in authority have had this right of not having to be questioned. How dare you question me? And especially you little Black dude. Now, here's where I do get on board, The criminal justice system is this huge piece that absolutely involves more than police. But police are the ones, in too many instances, taking our people's lives, and so we don't get to the other end to fight because we're losing our lives. And all an officer now has to say is, I fear for my life, from people without a gun, from people without a weapon of any kind, and in a couple of cases from people holding a cell phone. And if a police officer cannot tell the difference, I'm not talking about in the middle of the night, I'm talking about in broad daylight, between a cell phone and something that he or she carries on their hip all day, every day, then I do contend, I go back to what Dr. Dana Murray Patterson said, I do contend that there's a lack of empathy, there's a lack of understanding, and you're going to have that war. So the challenge for the pastor again is, I believe, you have to bring both of those entities together. And I ain't talking about the police chief, because you can have a decent chief and some terrible officers, but the chief is not the one that's going to answer the call in my neighborhood. The chief is not the one driving up and down the street every day. We have to do something to bring people together. And the one constant, at least in the Black community, historically, we're losing it now because we ain't as involved as we should be and used to be. The Black church was the one constant that we had. And if there was an entity that could bring us together, and I'm not talking about bringing a police officer in to say, you know, damn you. I'm not talking about bringing the community in to say, Grandma, you should have taught them better. I'm talking about on an even level. Let's bring them in, let's sit them down, and let's talk about what this thing, what a strong community looks like from the involvement and the input of both of us, not one carrying authority and the other one does not. Because this is why you also don't have citizens willing to cooperate with police departments. When I hear people talking about the no snitch rule, that came from policing. That's where I learned it. Police officers don't tell on each other. It was the blue code of silence. And so it spilled into the community. So now the community says, well, they don't snitch on each other. I guess we don't snitch on each other. And there's no end to it in sight. And I do believe that the church has that power even now, even for our lack of being displaced. We still have the power where we can do something about it. I believe personally on both ends, if we're willing to do that. But I don't think the conversation can begin with, because I have the authority, because I have the power. No,
in
I
this
think it has to
whole
come together.
issue, especially in our community. Historically, we're dealing with interactions that my grandfather dealt with, my great-grandfather dealt with, my father dealt with. I thought as a child, when my father had the talk with me, that when I got to be an old man, I would not have to have that talk with my son. And here I'm finding into the fourth and fifth generation, we still have this abuse of power or this fear of interaction with the power. You know, I'm 62 years old, and when I see blue lights, I get antsy, because I know it may not just be a ticket. You know, it may mean that I might have to go to jail for speeding, whereas a white guy write a ticket, fuss about it, and go on about his business. I remember having a weapon drawn on me because I protested about receiving a ticket. And I made the comment, "You're robbing me. You might as well stick that gun in my face." And the officer accommodated me. You know, and my thought was, well, my son won't have to deal with that. And here I'm looking 40 years later, and my son's having to deal with the same stuff that I dealt with. And I think one of the big issues that we're having, that we're manifesting in de-escalation, defunding, Black Lives Matter, it all comes down to the bottom line of how long are we as a society are going to allow this type of behavior to go unchecked. And at what point, where do we begin the dialogue? When you have a lawless president, when you have a speaker or a Senate majority leader who ignores the Constitution, when you have Supreme Court justices who have the authority to say what they think the Constitution means. And a Congress who cannot mutually respect each other enough to come up with laws that can be mutually agreed upon, that we're going to allow these laws to govern us. So, you know, and it comes down to who is going to be the voice that says, let's justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. If the church doesn't do it, nobody else is equipped. No one else has the moral authority. No one else has the gumption, if you will, to stand and address these issues. And when we abdicate that authority, when we choose to not step in and exercise that God-given prophetic call, then we're just as bad as the folks who are allowing this stuff to continue. We have a moral obligation to call right, right, and wrong, wrong.
Well, Reverend, we couldn't end on a better note than that, because the bishop and I are just dreaming of the time that more people in this nation would understand that the church really have the duties to step up and to intervene and to make things different. Now, Bishop, I'm going to give you the last word, but you got to do it in about a minute, because our technical director has another program she has to go to in 2 minutes. Close out, please.
No problem, Chief. I can do it quicker than that. I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being on this call. Chief, thank you so very, very much, hosting these 2 meetings and putting us and starting us on the right foot. And this is only a beginning of the kind of teaching and the kind of work that we will be dealing with going out as we move on and as we continue next month. I know we're going to take a long, hard look at where the church is, where the church ought to be, and how we get to where we need to be. And it's going to be centered around some social justice issues. And so we're grateful for this inner circle, and we're going to continue to fight the good fight. I would simply end, Chief, of all hearts, I want to thank Sister Bernice for jumping in there and taking over our technical stuff, as I thank, again, all of you for being on this call. God bless you. We love you, and look for your invitation for the next call. And if the judge can get through there, I'm going to ask him to dismiss us with prayer. I see he's still driving. I can see him in that Rolls Royce out there.
No, let me do it so we can get out of here. Thank you, dear Lord. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody have a blessed day.
So long.
Have a
All
good
right.
evening, everyone.